Charlie Keeling Aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team, and I'll be taking us through this session today. But first, we have our lovely commission team member, Tanya, with us, and she's going to lead us into the session with a karakia.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tanya Lachlan taku ingoa, no Ngāti Tūwhareto, nā puhi Ngāti Whātua. Poi poi a te Māori, poi poi a te Wairua, poi poi a te Tapu, poi poi a te whenua o Papatūānuku. Nurture the life force, nurture the spirit, nurture the sacredness, nurture the lands of Mother Earth. Kia ora rā.
Kia ora. Thank you, Tanya. So, it's been a busy few days for us here at the Commission. As you're probably aware, on Sunday we released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets. And at 9 AM yesterday, consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. So this means that until 14th of March, you can make a submission and tell us what you think about our mahi. I'll post a link to our consultation page in the chat at the end of the session. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, and it's really important to remember that we're open to changing our advice to reflect what we hear during this consultation period. So to start us off, could you please write your name and the organisation or community you represent, and tell us where you're dialing in from in Aotearoa. Since we can't see your faces, it's really nice to see who we've got joining us today. Kia ora, Scott. Thank you for your feedback. Kia ora, Nesta, Nick, Andy, kia ora. Great to see so many of you on here today. So today you'll be hearing from our expert commissioner, Catherine Leining, and our principal analyst, Eva Murray. We know that ETS is of interest to many of you, and you'll probably want to hear how our advice affects the ETS as it is and what opportunities we see for the ETS as we transition to a low emissions economy. So Catherine and Eva will be talking you through some of these things today. After each section, you'll have the chance to ask questions on what you've heard or what you want to find out. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions. We won't have time to answer all the questions on the call, unfortunately, and we won't be able to answer anything too technical, so please try and keep your questions concise. If you do want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, feel free to use the chat. It's great to see you having conversation during the Zoom. So that's enough from me for now. So I'll pass over to Catherine first of all, who will be kicking us off with today's topic. Kia ora, Catherine.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Catherine Leining toko ingoa. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you very much for making this time available to share our webinar on the role of emissions pricing in our draft advice. Just to address one of the questions that popped up, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, and the slide pack will be available as well. So that will make the note taking a little bit easier as you go through. We wanted to leave you with 3 key messages for today. The first is that to achieve ambitious emissions budgets, Aotearoa will need an integrated suite of climate change and other policies. Emissions pricing will play an important role alongside other policies needed to overcome the full range of barriers to reducing emissions. The second message is that our advice focuses on the direction of policy for the government's first emissions reduction plan, and the detailed policy design rests with government. Our key advice on the ETS is to align the ambition of settings for unit supply, price controls, and forestry to deliver on the ambition of our emissions budgets. We also identify further improvements that will help make the NZETS more effective. And the third key message is that in our draft advice and in our webinar, we are not presenting unit supply or emissions price forecasts for the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. We want to be very clear about that. So we'd like to go to the first slide, please. We'll have Eva sharing the slide pack. So essentially, I'm going to provide some overall framing information on how emissions pricing fits into the package of advice, and then Eva will pick up some of the more detailed recommendations on the ETS. And Eva, if you could please go ahead to the next slide. Now the next one. Thank you. So under the Climate Change Response Act, with the amendments that were put in 2019 and 2020, The Climate Change Commission is given very specific roles with regard to emission pricing and particularly the NZETS. Under this package of advice, as I said, our advice focuses on the direction of policy for the government's emissions reduction plan. Once the government has put emissions budgets in place, then we will pick up additional roles starting annually from 2022 when we provide advice on ETS unit supply and price control settings as part of the government's annual cycle of decision making. Also in June 2022, we'll be providing a review of the progress of He Waka Eka Noa, the partnership between government and the agriculture sector to prepare for emission pricing. And in 2022, we will also be providing advice on assistance to participants in the agricultural pricing mechanism. Then, as requested by the minister, we can also provide advice on increased or decreased phase-out rates for industrial allocation. So next slide, please. So in our draft advice, our recommendations are organized into 3 categories: emissions budget recommendations, enabling recommendations, and policy recommendations. And within policy recommendations, you're going to see references to time-critical necessary actions and then to other necessary actions. And we've used this hierarchy because we wanted to be very clear to government about what the policy priorities are for immediate action. And these are the types of progress we'll be looking for in particular when we do our monitoring of the government's progress in implementation. So as you go through the advice, you can pay attention to which of these advice categories apply to the ETS. Next slide, please. Now, navigating through this very large report takes some effort, and emissions pricing actually plays a broader role in the report beyond the NZETS. So the team has put together this really helpful navigator's guide to all of you who are trying to track down the different elements that are relevant to emissions pricing. And you can go through this in detail when you download the slides. I'll just highlight that our advice on emissions pricing also extends to the policy for reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, voluntary offsetting, the role of offshore mitigation and emissions budgets in the NDC, and the role of shadow pricing in helping to guide decisions by central and local government and other entities. The next slide, please. So this diagram presents our overall framework for advising on the direction of policy. And I'll start from the middle and work outward. In the middle there, you'll see pricing to influence investments and choices. And we also have a second pillar, which is action to address barriers. So these are non-price barriers to action. And then the third pillar is investment to spur innovation and system transformation. So there really are 3 core policy pillars here, not just emissions pricing. And these 3 pillars need to be integrated in their implementation. Across all 3 pillars, we're going to need to have supporting strategies for managing challenges and the impacts to ensure an equitable transition. Then we're going to need to have effective governance structures to deliver this transition across policy pillars. And we're going to need to have clear and credibly signaled outcomes for policies that align with the emissions budgets and the longer term targets. Then encircling the entire policy package, we have a genuine partnership approach between central and local government and iwi and Māori. And this enables the integration of insights from Te Ao Māori and Matauranga Māori to be reflected across the whole policy package. So we're hoping that this helps to orient the emissions pricing mechanisms, particularly the ETS, within the broader framework for achieving emissions outcomes in policy. So that concludes my sort of framing comments for the presentation. I will pause briefly here for questions to see if there's any on that, and then we'll come back to Eva and there'll be more time for questions in the end.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions, but just a reminder, you can post them in the Q&A box at the bottom. I'll just give a couple of minute or so and see if there are any questions that come through. Yeah, we'll move on to Eva now, and if you have any other questions on Catherine's section, we're happy to answer them later on. So thank you, Eva. Eva, sorry, you're just on mute.
Sorry. turned on my video but didn't unmute myself. Hi, I'm Eva Murray. I'm on the staff here at the Commission with a role focused on, policy and accounting and various other issues. What I'm going to talk about in this next session is some of the more specific recommendations, policy recommendations that the Commission has put forward in its draft advice report that relate to the ETS. And just to note, this is really an overview, an introduction. We'll get into some of the specifics, but we do expect that many of you will want to dig into this further, and there'll be other opportunities to engage with us throughout the consultation period, including there are some further public webinars planned, including particularly for those of you who are interested in digging more into the modelling, which sort of sits behind some of this, what I'm going to talk about today. So really, in our policy recommendations, the key one to look at for the NZ ETS is time critical necessary action 7, which is on page 133 of our advice report. So this is sort of rolls up a number of key matters that we think the government needs to address as a priority in terms of adjusting the ETS to make it better equipped to support our low emissions transition going forward. So there's sort of 4 parts to this recommendation. Today, we're going to talk most about the first 2 issues, which are about aligning the unit volumes in the ETS with emissions budgets and amending the price control settings to reflect the evidence that we now have about abatement costs in New Zealand. I will also touch on briefly what we're saying about forestry. And then the 4th one, which I won't go into depth on today, is really, we think there's a key gap in the market oversight of the ETS that needs to be addressed. This is something that should be a priority, although of course, whatever the government does in this area will need to be tailored to the specific characteristics of the New Zealand emissions trading scheme market, particularly reflecting the nature of the participants we have in this market, which is somewhat different from financial markets, for example. So in terms of the unit volumes and the price control settings, I'll move on to that now. Of course, as many of you will be aware, the government set a cap on the ETS for the first time last year. And in order to do this, it basically, because the Commission had not really been set up at that stage and hadn't been able to give advice on emissions budgets, what the government did as a stopgap measure was to develop a provisional emissions budget to guide the setting of the cap on the ETS. So what we're sort of going to do now is just a little comparison of the emissions budgets that the government has proposed and the provisional emissions budget which the government used to do the first round of ETS unit supply settings in the regs that were put in place last year. So just this slide here shows the volume of the provisional emissions budget and the pathway that budget followed, which was essentially a straight line to 2050, to the 2050 target, and then the baseline projection that the government used at that time last year when it set this. At that time, I think they had limited, the COVID-19 pandemic was sort of kicking off, and they had incorporated some sort of adjustment to the baseline to reflect the impacts of COVID-19, but it was still pretty early days when they made that projection. And in this slide, I can show you here, this is how our emissions budgets compare to this provisional emissions budgets. There's a few things to note here. One is that our emissions budgets, the first emissions budgets that we're putting forward under the legislation, it starts in 2022. So that's a slight difference. So what we've done here is that we've incorporated the year 2021 to sort of make sure that we're comparing the right numbers with, apples with apples. But the first emission budget does only start in 2022 and goes to 2025. So as you can see, there are some differences, and we've got the numbers in the table at the side, which you can dig into later if you wish. But one important difference is that actually the baseline has now shifted downwards, and this is to a large extent because we now have more information about the impact on emissions of COVID-19 and the current economic situation. So that accounts for a large amount of the difference between our baseline projection and the baseline the government used last year. In terms of our baseline, it is we have aligned it quite closely, as close as possible, with the government's baseline in terms of what we understand about the impacts of COVID-19. There are some other factors in there that also help to bring that baseline down in terms of some improved estimates of, improved projections of waste emissions going forward and things like that. They're all relatively small, but they do cumulatively contribute to this downward shift in the baseline. And then you can see also that the pathway for the emissions budgets that the Commission has proposed is also somewhat different from the provisional emissions budget pathway. So actually, and as you can see in the table, although it's overall shifted downwards because of the downwards shift in emissions that we're now projecting, the abatement in this first period, 2021 to 2025, the abatement needed is actually a little bit lower. This is partly because if you look at the sort of the wedge between our baseline and our path, it does start a little bit more gradually than the PEB path, just to reflect that it is, it's going to take a while to get going and actually seeing the, emissions reductions flowing through the economy. You can put measures in place to reduce emissions, but then that takes a while to feed through to actual changes in emissions. But as you can see, as it projects further out to 2035, the wedge in our pathway does widen out, and so we see a ramping up over time to a greater extent than what was in the provisional emissions budget. So hopefully that fills in a bit of information that we unfortunately couldn't quite fit into our report, but which I know everyone with an interest in the ETS will be keen to understand. So we can now move on to the issue of the price settings in the ETS. And basically what we're saying is that when the government next updates, in terms of these volumes, what the government needs to do is when it next updates the volumes in the ETS settings, which will happen again this year. We now have an annual process for revising ETS settings. These new volumes should be incorporated into that update. But moving on to the price settings, we're going to talk a little bit about how we've come to the information that sits behind the recommendation we're making about the ETS price settings, which really arises from our modelling. And I'm actually going to ask my colleague, Paul Young, to talk a little bit about this. Again, just as an introductory comment, in talking about this information on costs or emissions values used in our modelling, it's really important to be aware that these are not forecasts of the ETS price, just to be really clear. The information about abatement costs that, for reducing emissions in the economy and what price we might eventually see in the ETS will depend to a large extent on the combination of policies the government uses to encourage emission reductions, and the extent to which other policies are driving that as compared to the ETS. But to talk a little bit about this graph, which is now on your screen, I'll now hand over to Paul.
Hi, Eva, sorry, just quickly, we've had a query in the chat asking, saying I missed what PEB means. Would you mind just recapping on that before we hand over to Paul?
Yeah, that PEB stands for the Provisional Emissions Budget. So, and this refers to something that the government developed. It's a provisional emissions budget that the government, led by MFE, Ministry for the Environment, developed last year in order to guide the first round of ETS settings. The government had to put in place regulations last year to determine ETS auction volumes and things like that, as well as the price controls in the ETS. And because emissions budgets weren't available at that time, the government developed its own provisional emissions budget as a kind of interim measure before the emissions budgets that we're talking about now became available. Hopefully that clarifies things.
Okay, kia ora koutou. Yeah, I'm Paul. So this chart is taken from chapter 8 of our evidence report, and I'll just speak to it briefly. If you've read any of the report or seen any of the coverage, you've hopefully picked up that our approach in designing our pathways has been around really focusing on reducing gross emissions as far as possible. And we've taken a different approach to forestry, which in a nutshell is really about seeing, how much forestry we would need alongside that reducing gross emissions as far as we can to meet our targets. So this chart is showing the emissions values that apply to the energy and transport sectors within our model path and long-term scenarios. So it goes all the way out to 2050. And this is a model input which we arrived at through some iteration and sort of manual goal seeking. So it's not a pure output from the model that we used. So how do we arrive at it? You're probably interested. We've looked at the emissions values that we need in the long run, so required by 2050, for the sectors that where we're modeling mitigation measures to basically be decarbonized or close to full decarbonisation. And so that landed around $250 in 2050. And then our path towards that, we discount back at a chosen discount rate of 3%. But then we join up to that value in 2030 with a straight line from sort of today's market prices. And this is to sort of avoid a large discontinuity or shock, I guess, by imposing, by discounting all the way back to today. It also might, represent sort of a staged increase in policy effort and emissions prices in the economy. So hopefully that explains it, and there is some more text around that in the report if you want to go back to that. So I'll hand back to Eva.
Okay, so so this is the sort of information from our modelling which has informed the recommendations we've made in this critical action 7 about what should happen to the ETS auction reserve price and the cost containment reserve trigger price. So to recap for everyone, the ETS is now being reformed. Auctioning of NZUs is commencing shortly in March, I believe. And as part of rolling that out, we also are going to have different price controls in the ETS from before. Instead of a fixed price option, which is still in place for this year, we will be moving into more having these price controls that are implemented through auctioning. So there's an auction reserve, there will be an auction reserve price floor. How that works is that a price is set below which the government will no longer be selling units into the market. So if the price drops that low, the government will hold back units, and then that will in turn flow through to influencing the price. And it's not a hard price floor. The price in the secondary market can of course go below this auction reserve price, but it does prevent the government's auctioning from causing further price decline. And also to explain the cost containment reserve, this is a volume of units that is sort of set aside, which are not planned to be auctioned, but if the price does reach a certain trigger, then these units will be released into the market. And again, this is not a hard price ceiling. It will influence the price. The further volume released into the market should put a brake on further price rises, but the secondary market price can still climb above this value. It's important to, I should really note that these price measures, the auction reserve price and the cost containment reserve, are really designed as guardrails. They're sort of like a safety net to prevent prices in the market going, excessively high or excessively low. They're meant to be set at a level that's kind of where they're not triggered. They're not meant to really be driving the price or setting the price in the market. So you do need to have the corridor set by these price measures needs to be sufficiently wide so that the market can actually find that, discover the price, based on, fundamentals and information about the units that are out there and the abatement opportunities that exist. So in our recommendation, in our draft recommendation, so of course we are consulting on all of this and we are keen to get everybody's feedback, and particularly in terms of, evidence or alternative ways of thinking about this issue. We are suggesting that the current price settings in the ETS do need to be amended to reflect what we know about New Zealand's pathway for reducing emissions if we are to meet the emissions budgets and if we are to meet our 2050 target from the Zero Carbon Act. So what this graph here shows, and just to explain, it's in real prices. So what's on this graph doesn't incorporate an inflation adjustment. So what this shows is the current auction reserve price and the current cost containment reserve, which is in the ETS regulations. So that's set at a flat rate. If you're thinking about real prices of $20 and $50, there is actually, in the regulations, there's an inflation adjustment of 2% per year. So in nominal prices, the value of this $20 and $50 goes up. We're just showing it in real prices here because although we are also recommending that the government continue to factor in inflation to these settings, that inflation adjustment may need to be adjusted over time to reflect what's actually going on in the economy. So the government last year, when it set these settings, used a 2% per annum inflation adjustment. That will need to be reevaluated this year and in future years when they update the settings to see whether that's still appropriate depending on what's actually occurring in terms of inflation. But in real prices, to reflect the information from our modelling that Paul has just talked about the abatement costs, or which are marginal abatement costs, I should indicate, that may need to be for the abatement opportunities that will need to happen in New Zealand if we are to meet our targets. We're suggesting that the auction reserve price and the cost containment reserve do need to step up. What we're suggesting is an initial step up for the cost for the let me just get the information, for the auction reserve price from $20 up to $30 immediately as soon as possible, and then a 5% annual step up for that auction reserve price annually from now on. And then with the cost containment reserve, an immediate step up to about $70 with a 10% annual increase plus inflation from now on. And that's what the dotted lines on this chart are showing, a comparison of the price corridor that we're proposing as compared to the government's, the price corridor that's currently in the government regulations. The pink dot, also to the left, is basically the current price, which was, as of last week, was around $38. It may have shifted a bit now. So as you can see, we're suggesting a more gradual increase to the auction reserve price. And the reason for our sort of step up to $30 at the beginning of this pathway is basically there's a lot of investments that have been sort of encouraged by the ETS in recent years, with expectations of prices, in the $20s to the $30s, a lot of forestry planting. And we think that actually it's really important to protect those investments going forward, because the forestry planting that's occurring now is a really important part of our pathway for meeting the emissions budgets and meeting the 2050 target along the way. We're suggesting a 5% step up over time, because it does need to signal an increase over time, but at the same time you've got to balance that with not creating unintended speculative opportunities for people and encouraging people to hold units just because they're expecting continual price rises in the future. In terms of the cost containment reserve, that essentially mirrors the pathway of the prices in the graph that Paul just showed you. Of course, those are marginal abatement costs, driven strongly by what we know about abatement in the heat industry and power sector, and also transport. There will be actually a lot of abatement available below those prices, because they are just reflecting kind of the most expensive opportunities that might be occurring in the economy, and according to those projections. So we think that this corridor provides, a pretty, good signal about what might be needed for New Zealand in future, but it certainly leaves a broad area for the ETS to find the price. And at this stage, it's very important to keep in mind that we're recommending the government put in place a full suite of climate policies alongside the ETS, and those policies, some of them will be really important in driving the abatement that's needed in combination with the ETS. So we certainly don't expect that this cost containment reserve price trigger is going to be the price in the market. So,
Hi, sorry, before you move on to the next bit, I'm wondering if we could just pause for a few questions that we've had coming through, and open those up, and then we can go back to finish your presenting and then go back to questions. Does that sound okay? Catherine, I don't know if you want to jump on as well. I'm not sure if there'll be any that will be good for you to answer, but I just wanted to apologise as well for the bot or the trolls that we had in the chat earlier. We've removed all of those, so sorry about that for the inappropriate comments. So the first question we've got in the Q&A, this is quite a long one, but I'll read it all out. It's often asserted that pricing is a necessary but alone insufficient tool to achieve the emissions required to 2050. Can you elaborate where and under what circumstances non-price measures are justified? We need this clarity and discipline so that we can minimise risk of the waterbed effect, whereby non-price measures simply shuffle around tons of carbon within the same overall ETS cap and artificially suppress the price of carbon in the ETS. Sorry, that was a wordy one, but I'm not sure, either or Catherine, would you like to take that?
I'd be happy to dive in on that one. It relates to my piece of the presentation. Thank you. There's a very clear explanation of the waterbed effect in our advice for people who are not aware. It's because when you have a fixed ETS cap, when one player within the system makes a reduction, it means that someone else in the system does not have to make a reduction. The fact that we're building our advice on is that there are both price and non-price barriers to change. When you look at the set of marginal abatement cost curves, there's always a block of reductions that actually fall into the negative to zero cost range. And it's because they just don't respond to price. These are things that would already be profitable for people to be doing today, but they aren't being driven by today's price incentives, and simply boosting an ETS price may not touch those. So we need additional policies to address non-price barriers to change. These are things like availability of information, access to capacity building, help with energy efficiency standards that are relating to behavior change and habit. So those are the types of policies that may be necessary there. On the far right of a marginal abatement cost curve, you see a bunch of interventions that require a really high price and often require significant government intervention because they are cutting edge investments that will unfold over time. And the type of emission price that you need to drive that kind of change is not socially acceptable or necessary across the rest of the economy. So again, we need a suite of policies that help to drive that change on the innovation front. We really need a comprehensive package. Even within an ETS cap, even within the band of things that might just respond to a price, the government might want to consider policy interventions to address just transition concerns, because they can redistribute costs within a cap. So we do think that there's a rational basis for integrating emissions pricing and other policies. To the extent that this is set as a package, which is certainly what we recommend, then the waterbed effect from other policies can actually be accommodated when setting the initial cap. Otherwise, if additional policies come along that weren't foreseen when this cap was set, because we have a rolling annual adjustment of the cap, there's always an opportunity to adjust future supply if necessary to accommodate additional policies that come in. So we feel that the architecture does accommodate the integration of pricing and policies with managing the waterbed effect and sustaining whatever domestic emission price pathway the government is looking for.
Thank you, Catherine. That was great. We've had a couple of questions on forestry, but I know that Eva's going to cover that in the next part of the session. So I'll just ask one more question and then we can move back to Eva. Why has the range between ARP and CCR increased in the proposed settings?
So this is essentially what I was just going over, is that in the analysis that we've done to look at the emission reductions that New Zealand, needs to implement to reach our 2050 target and to meet the emissions budgets that we are proposing, the abatement costs are significantly higher than what these current settings permit. So even though we don't think that these, the kind of abatement costs that were on the graph that Paul spoke to earlier, we don't think that these will necessarily be the price in the ETS. What it does tell us is that having a price ceiling of only $50, a flat price ceiling of only $50 going out into the future is probably not appropriate. It probably needs to be higher.
Thank you, Eva. If you'd like to continue now, that would be great to hear the next part of your presentation. Thank you, Catherine, as well.
And I'll just add one more thing to what Catherine said in response to the first question, which in terms of where you can find more information on this issue of price versus non-price policies, we've got quite a good discussion of that in the evidence report. There's not so much in our advice report, but in our evidence report, chapter 16 on our policy approach, there's quite a bit of information in there, including a discussion of the waterbed effect and why that doesn't have to be a problem given the design of the NZETS and the 5-year rolling cap system that's been put in place. So of course, given I've just outlined the increases to the price corridor, immediately people are, we expect people will ask, well, are we getting out of step with the rest of the world on this? Are we going to be imposing excessive costs on our economy, or, are other countries doing anything similar? So just to kind of illustrate this question, the answer to this question, we have this slide and the next slide has some information about what's happening with emissions pricing in other countries and subnational jurisdictions around the world. This graph, which might be a little bit small depending on the size of your screen, just shows current emissions prices from a range of jurisdictions around the world. We sort of, there are actually more than this. If you go to something called the World Bank Carbon Pricing Dashboard, the links in the slide, you can have a look at the full information about this. But we just took all the schemes that have a price of about $20 or above in New Zealand dollars. And as you can see, New Zealand, I mean, this reflects prices from the end of last year. But as you can see, New Zealand's kind of in the, we're in the middle of a pack there. Of countries and jurisdictions that have emissions pricings in the sort of, $30 range. And there are some countries at the moment who have some very very high carbon taxes in particular, particularly the Nordic countries. And some of these carbon taxes are actually covering quite a broad section of their economy. For example, the Norwegian carbon tax covers about 60% of their emissions. It's pretty much everything in Norway that's not in the European emissions trading scheme. So yeah, so we're not alone in doing this. But also looking forward in terms of what we know about emissions prices in other jurisdictions going out to 2030, here's some information from studies or from announcements that other governments have made about what emissions prices they're expecting to implement in their emissions trading schemes or their carbon taxes. So some of these are modelled carbon prices. So for the EU ETS, this reflects the modelling that the European Commission has done about the price that will be needed in that scheme to deliver the emissions reductions they need. So that's why it's a range. I would say there's many analysts in Europe who, spend a lot of their time trying to forecast what the EU ETS price could be. And there's certainly other forecasts which are significantly higher than what's here, which is from one study undertaken by the European Commission. Canada recently announced last year that it would be increasing its federal carbon pricing scheme, price up to its sort of price ceiling, up to 170 Canadian dollars by 2030. That's about 185 New Zealand dollars. Germany, as well as the EU ETS, they're implementing a domestic emissions trading scheme covering buildings and transport. California's price ceiling and floor is climbing up towards $140 New Zealand in 2030. And countries such as Ireland and Norway, who have carbon taxes, I should say, are also planning significant increases to those taxes. So I guess what this shows is that, we're in good company alongside a range of other countries who are looking to reduce emissions. These sort of settings that we're putting forward are kind of in the ballpark of what's happening in a lot of other parts of the world. So should I stop there? Do we have any questions or move on?
I think carry on, Eva, because we're on a roll, and then we can have a 10 minutes for questions at the end. That would be good. Thank you.
Yeah. So the next topic I'll just go over briefly. In this ETS recommendation, we also suggest that the government needs to look at the settings for forestry in the ETS, or arrangements for forestry in the ETS. This is because as part of recommending emissions budgets, we've also recommended an amount of emission reductions as compared to carbon dioxide removals for meeting those emissions budgets. This is actually something we're required to do as part of the legislation. But in terms of coming to that budget recommendation, which is in budget recommendation 2, we've thought very carefully about the pathway that New Zealand should follow for meeting the 2050 target. And in terms of looking at the potential pathways New Zealand has followed, we've really prioritised decarbonising the economy. So this is reducing gross emissions. That will, it's only reducing gross emissions that will really, make a transition for New Zealand to a low emissions economy, and will allow us to maintain that net zero, target beyond 2050. If we rely to a very large extent on forestry removals, that risks kind of shifting the burden of emissions reductions onto future generations, and it risks kind of bouncing up above net zero again after 2050. And so we've looked carefully at the role of exotic forestry in helping us get to 2050, and there's certainly a very important role for exotic forestry, but we have to be mindful that in terms of the removals that we can count for new exotic forestry, there's kind of a time limit on that. We can only count removals up until those forests reach their long-term average. So it's not really a long-term or permanent solution. We've also looked at how native forestry can play a role. And you know, that certainly native forestry, we're recommending that there be greater efforts to make use of our opportunities there. Native forestry, you know, provides a much longer term carbon sink, although of course the carbon dioxide removals from native forestry take, you know, a lot longer to kind of come online, even though they endure for much longer over time. So in terms of this focus on reducing gross emissions, this has informed the balance of emission reductions and removals that we've recommended. And this is actually a lower amount of carbon dioxide removals from forestry than is currently projected in the government's current policy baseline. So the baseline is the term that we use to kind of talk about the projection out into the future if we just maintain current policies. And so that baseline projection, current policy baseline projection, assumes an emissions price of $35 going into the future, which drives a significant amount of exotic, you know, afforestation. So our recommended amount of removals is somewhat below this, and it's a different mix from what we'd see in this current policy kind of reference case. So what we've said in our ETS recommendation is that the government needs to look at its policies in terms of both the ETS and in terms of other policies. There might be a role for land use planning rules here as well, about how policies can deliver the amount of removals that we're recommending. So in terms of what this might mean going forward, there are actually a number of ways that the government could adjust its policies to affect the amount of, you know, afforestation we might get. In terms of the ETS, for example, there could be some limits that are placed on surrenders of forestry units. There could be some changes to rules around how foresters can earn units for exotic plantation forests. There's also the potential to make changes to the eligibility rules. So there's a number of options. This is going to be something that the government is going to have to really carefully consider and examine, because the way this could be, the way this is done could have quite different distributional impacts on different people. And it's really important that that be looked at really, really carefully before any changes are made, to really understand what the implications of any changes might be. Also, you know, while the ETS probably has a role in influencing the total amount of plantation forestry that might be planted, it's probably not very well suited as a policy instrument to kind of influencing exactly where forests might be planted. This is something that, I mean, we've definitely heard from a number of stakeholders that there are concerns about this, about large scale afforestation all happening in one region and having, you know, impacts on local communities. The ETS, if this is something that needs to be addressed, the ETS may not be the right tool for this. It may be more planning type rules would be more appropriate for addressing those issues. So we expect there's likely to be a combination of policies needed here, and it's not something that you know, should be done without a proper process, because it is a very complex area, and it's really important that all the impacts and implications of any changes that might be made are well understood. And also, just to clarify, in terms of maybe something I should have said earlier, but I didn't, is that in terms of this amount of removals that we're recommending, it does actually align with the government's current policy scenario or reference case out to 2030. It's only from the 2030s onwards that that our pathway does diverge from the sort of current policy scenario. So this is something that's more an issue for the 2030s onwards rather than exactly right now. But yeah, so we are suggesting that how forestry is handled in the ETS needs to be looked at. Yeah, and then this is my final slide, which is really just to mention that as well as this critical action recommendation, we've also got another sort of recommendation around necessary actions that the government needs to continue with in relation to improving the ETS. This is basically covers a range of matters most of which are already on the government's work program. And we just wanted to make clear that all of these things are actually still really important and need to continue, even though they don't quite have the same priority as the other issues that we've mentioned. So this involves, looking at how to recycle the auction proceeds from the ETS, taking a look to see that our industrial allocation policy is still fit for purpose, continuing with the phase out that's currently planned, that's already in the legislation, looking at different ways of addressing emissions leakage risk, improving the information that's available to ETS participants about how the ETS cap will be managed over time. In particular, we think there's definitely room for improvement there, and it would be really useful for the government to outline how it intends to manage the cap in the future. Given that we now have split gas targets, that's something that it hasn't really been outlined to anyone yet how that's going to work. And of course, clarifying the role and avenues for voluntary mitigation in New Zealand. So basically voluntary offsetting and whether that can or how that can happen in New Zealand into the future. Government's already working on this, but it's important and it needs to continue. And so that was all from me in terms of slides.
Thank you, Eva, that was great. And we've got a few questions. We probably won't get to answer all of them, but we've got 9 minutes, so we can whiz through as many as we can. We've had one, you mentioned that the ETS had resulted in significant reductions in emissions. Can you give examples outside of forestry? I'm not sure if...
Sorry, can you just repeat that? I didn't quite catch the first part of it.
Oh yeah, sorry, 1 second. You mentioned that the ETS had resulted in significant reductions in emissions. Can you give examples outside of forestry?
So I think I made a general statement about how emissions trading schemes can play an important role in reducing emissions. In New Zealand, because some of our lowest cost abatement opportunities are in forestry, most of the emissions reductions we've seen have been in forestry. There is certainly, it has driven a bit of fuel switching, I think, and it has had, I do understand that it has had some impact on the waste sector as well.
Great, thank you. This is one I think Catherine will be good to answer, but you might want to chip in, Eva. It's a bit of a long one again, but say the number of NZUs which are available for auction for a given budget period are not required for that budget period. So essentially we are emitting less than our target amounts. Would the Climate Change Commission suggest that the New Zealand government sells these NZUs to other countries or overseas businesses for them to meet their NDCs? If so, how would the prices work? Would the units be sold internationally for the same price as they would be priced at in the NZ ETS?
Thanks. I'll dive in on initial answer on that. Thank you very much for the question. As a starting point, there's a really important distinction to be made between the auction mechanism and the emissions trading scheme and how New Zealand achieves its international target under the Paris Agreement, which is its NDC, its nationally determined contribution. Those two systems actually operate independently. The ETS is a purely domestic mechanism. NZUs cannot be sold overseas and they're not recognized in overseas market and they wouldn't count toward anyone's Paris target. We will be doing a webinar next Tuesday that goes into more detail on the NDC. I think an important point here is that our emissions budgets that we've proposed map our domestic emission reduction pathway. And beyond that, the government makes its global contribution under its NDC, which even under our current NDC, would be greater than our domestic contribution, and we would provide that extra reduction through offshore purchasing. So in terms of our Paris target, we expect not to be able to exceed our Paris target. And in fact, if our advice is taken, the Paris target will become even more ambitious than it is right now. So we would expect to be purchasing offshore mitigation rather than selling offshore. Within the ETS itself, the government has identified a clear mechanism for what happens if NZUs are not auctioned in a particular auction. And within a year, they get rolled forward to the next auction, and then they get canceled, and the government reevaluates its volume as it updates the cap. So there is a clear internal process for dealing with unauctioned units. It's just completely independent from the international process around meeting our target.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Did you have anything to add, Eva, or are you satisfied that covers it? We have another question. If, following the global comparison chart earlier, if for the sake of argument we entertain the notion that NZ would likely to be a leader on climate change, then within the scope of carbon pricing trading, are your recommendations key to earn us a leadership position within that scope, or will they merely keep us in the ranks of the mediocre? It's an interesting one.
Should I dive in on that one? It's just as a starting point. Is that all right? I think for a long time in the past, there was an expectation that somehow the world was going to converge toward a globally efficient emission price that was going to work for everyone. And I think what we're realizing now, especially in the new bottom-up world of the Paris targets, is that each country needs to decide an emission price pathway that suits that country. So what we see in terms of emission prices in other countries are very relevant reference points for us to consider, but we actually can choose, we maintain sovereignty over our own emission price pathway and can choose the pathway that works for us. Each country is on the same journey to decarbonization, but we're all at different points in that journey. And we all have different emission profiles to deliver to. So we really do need to design an emission price pathway that works for us. There isn't an international price that we can adopt that will necessarily work for us. And I think our ambition needs to be designed in the context of our own emissions profile.
Thank you, Catherine. And we have probably time for one more question, so I'll go with this one. It seems that controlling auction volumes cannot impose an effective annual cap while the stockpile exists and less than 50% of emissions are covered with the exclusion of agriculture. Is the Commission considering these broader issues?
So I can make an initial comment about that. In our recommendation, we have acknowledged that the NZU stockpile is an issue and that the cap going forward on the ETS should factor in the need to reduce that stockpile of units. And again, this is another reason why we're suggesting that the price settings in the ETS need to change, because they don't really correspond to what we know about the abatement opportunities in New Zealand and the cost of those. And while we have this, a relatively low cost containment reserve trigger price, there's, a high risk that it could be triggered, and it would be better to avoid that and make, because that would make the stockpile issue worse. And then what was the second part of the question? Agriculture. So I don't know if you want to comment on this, Catherine, but essentially, we don't know exactly how agricultural emissions will be priced at this point, although we know that the government is working with the sector to pursue an agricultural emissions pricing scheme. Previously, the Interim Climate Change Commission evaluated this question and found that emissions pricing is an important tool for promoting emission reductions in the agriculture sector. Their preference was to do that via a levy. They thought that was more suited to the characteristics of the sector. There's a process underway at the moment with the government working in the sector through He Waka Eka Noa. And we're keen to see how that, where that process will get to. So yeah, at this stage, we don't have a position on exactly how emissions pricing for agricultural emissions should occur, whether that happens in the ETS or through some other means. But we do see pricing agricultural emissions as an important part of the policy mix going forward. Oh, Charlie, you're on mute.
Yep, sorry. Thanks for that, Eva. Did you have anything to add, Catherine, or are you happy with that?
No, that was an excellent answer. I think just an additional point I would add is that if agriculture remains outside of the ETS, then the government will be having to ensure that the joint contributions from ETS sectors and non-ETS sectors will deliver on the emissions budgets. And so that they have to deliver on the emissions budgets, and the stockpiled NZUs have to be taken into account as well. And I think with the rolling update of the ETS caps, the government can make those adjustments. The basis for one of the recommendations that Eva touched on is that it would help to have for our market participants to have more certainty on how that effort sharing will adjust the cap over time.
Thank you, Catherine. Right, it's time to wrap up now. I know that Catherine mentioned and Eva mentioned that we have some upcoming webinars. So I'm just going to post the link to what we've got coming up in the next few weeks. We've got a great one on the 1.5 degrees in the NDC, on agriculture and forestry for those of you who are particularly interested in forestry today, and one on mitigation and adaptation coming up next week as well. I'm also going to post a link to our consultation website where you can have your say on our draft advice. And as I said earlier, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you to everyone who came along today. It's been great to hear from you all, and we hope you learned a lot. So I'm just going to ask Tanya to see us out with the closing karakia now.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Interesting kōrero. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tātou ariki, me te aroha, o te atua me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu. Ake ake, amen. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone.